Early 1942, a Mustang squadron crosses back over the English coast after another low-level sortie. The aircraft is fast, maneuverable, tough enough to absorb punishment and bring its pilots home. And it is being wasted. Day after day, these fighters skim hedgerows on reconnaissance and strafing runs, while American heavy bombers climb toward Germany without a single escort that can stay with them to the target and back. The Mustang's engine cannot hold its power at the altitudes where that war is being fought and lost. One Rolls-Royce test pilot believes he knows what will change that. Almost no one wants to hear it. The ground crews at RAF Sawbridgeworth pull the damp canvas covers off the olive-drab fuselages before dawn. It is the spring of 1942, and the morning air is thick with drizzle. The pilots of No. 26 Squadron walk out to their aircraft carrying leather map cases filled with low-altitude reconnaissance charts. There are no high-altitude flight plans here. The targets are canal locks, rail junctions, and German coastal batteries scattered across occupied France. Inside the cockpit, the startup is a familiar mechanical sequence. The pilot pumps the primer, clears the magneto switches, and presses the starter. The Allison V1710 engine catches with a sharp crack, settling into a deep, remarkably smooth idle. On the ground, the aircraft feels solid, responsive, and beautifully balanced. It is an engine designed with immense care, built to run for hours without complaint, and tough enough to swallow ground fire and keep turning. The squadron taxi out in pairs, the wide landing gear tracking steady over the wet grass. They lift off into the low overcast, keeping their noses down to avoid German radar. They fly at treetop level, skimming the hedgerows of Kent before dropping down over the gray, choppy waters of the English Channel. Far above them, invisible through the thick cloud layer, the heavy bomber streams are beginning to form. The young men in those B-17 bombers are climbing into the freezing, thin air of the upper atmosphere, heading toward the heart of Germany. The Mustang pilots know they are flying a fighter with clean, modern lines and unmatched endurance, yet their day will be spent dodging light anti-aircraft fire over French railway yards. They were not being sent to Berlin. They were being sent down. They skim the French dunes, eyes scanning the horizon for Focke-Wulfs that might dive from the high clouds where the real air war is raging. By May 1942, RAF Army Cooperation Command had fully integrated the Mustang Mark I into its operational structure. Squadrons like No. 26 at Sawbridgeworth and No. 2 quickly found that the clean, low-drag airframe was exceptionally suited for tactical reconnaissance and ground attack duties. At altitudes below 15,000 feet, the aircraft was fast, responsive, and remarkably stable. Pilots appreciated the wide-track landing gear on rough grass airfields and praised the excellent forward visibility during low-level navigation. The primary mission profile was unglamorous but essential. Pilots flew high-speed, single-aircraft sweeps over occupied France, scanning road networks, counting railway cars, and photographing German troop movements. This work established the Mustang's tactical value as a rugged, survivable platform capable of defending itself during high-speed dashes. This low-altitude capability faced its most severe test on August 19, 1942, during the Allied amphibious assault at Dieppe. Mustangs from No. 26 and No. 2 squadrons flew continuous, low-level sorties directly over the beaches and inland roads. They provided real-time intelligence on German reinforcements, spotted artillery positions, and conducted strafing runs against coastal batteries. Operating in the teeth of intense light anti-aircraft fire, the aircraft proved it could take punishment and still return to base. Yet, this tactical success exposed a distinct operational divide. While the Mustang spent its missions dodging tree trunks and telephone wires, other Allied fighters were assigned the high-altitude combat roles. Spitfires patrolled the upper atmosphere, engaging German fighters at 25,000 feet. The RAF valued the Mustang immensely, but only within its specific low-altitude envelope. For the high-stakes struggle over the European continent, the aircraft remained confined to the deck, a highly capable scout in a war that was increasingly moving into the stratosphere. When the Mustang Mark I taxied back to the grass runways of RAF Sawbridgeworth or Duxford, the ground crews did not find a broken or failed machine. They found an airframe that had performed exactly as designed. At low altitude, the fighter was exceptional. Pilots landing after high-speed sweeps over occupied France reported an aircraft of remarkable strength. It was fast, tracking straight through turbulent air, and its wide-track landing gear handled the uneven sod of temporary bases with ease. The Allison 5-1710 engine ran smoothly, proving highly reliable and resistant to the abrasive dust of summer airfields. It was a respected, durable power plant built with immense care. The pilots who flew these missions were highly trained professionals who pushed their mounts to the limits of the tactical envelope. They recognized the clean, low-drag aerodynamics of the laminar flow wing. The controls remained light and responsive during high-speed treetop dashes. Even when taking light anti-aircraft fire over French rail yards, the rugged structure brought its crew home. Ground crews quickly patched the bullet holes, refueled the tanks, and prepared the fighters for the next sweep. Within its established boundaries, the aircraft was a triumph of design. But as the engines were shut down and the propellers swung to a halt, the pilots looked up. High above, the contrails of the heavy bomber streams carved white lines across the cold blue sky. The B-17 bombers and B-24 bombers pressed eastward toward Germany, entering thin, freezing air where Luftwaffe fighters waited. The Mustangs remained on the ground, their generous internal fuel tanks still mostly full, unable to climb with them. This mismatch left a quiet, pressing question for Allied planners. Was this aerodynamically advanced airframe fundamentally limited, or was its power plant simply holding it back? To understand the choice of the Allison 5-1710, one must look at the strategic reality of 1940. The British Purchasing Commission needed modern fighters immediately, and North American aviation committed to designing and building a completely new prototype in just 120 days. In the United States, the Allison VJ-12 was the only liquid-cooled inline engine in active mass production. Selecting it was not a mistake, nor was it the result of poor workmanship or short-sighted engineering. It was a highly rational, pragmatic wartime decision. In the initial Mustang installation, the Allison 5-1710 delivered approximately 1,150 horsepower at sea level. This was a robust and highly efficient power plant, noted for its mechanical dependability, smooth power delivery, and ease of maintenance. The engine featured a single-stage, crankshaft-driven centrifugal supercharger with a moderate gear ratio. This supercharger architecture was intentionally designed to maximize performance in the dense air of lower altitudes, where the aircraft was expected to operate. During this phase of the war, British and American planners were responding to different tactical requirements. The RAF required a fast, durable platform for low-altitude tactical reconnaissance, Army cooperation, and close support duties. At altitudes below 15,000 feet, where these missions took place, the Allison-powered Mustang was exceptional. Its speed, clean aerodynamics, and stable handling made it highly effective at skimming treetops and dodging ground fire. Designing, testing, and tooling a complex multi-stage supercharger required years of development, time the Allies simply did not have in 1940. The engineers at North American Aviation and Allison responded to an urgent crisis with a ready, highly reliable solution. The V-1710 did not fail its creators. It met every design specification perfectly. The engine was a respected, durable power plant that gave the early Mustang its start, proving that the initial design was a triumph of practical wartime engineering, built to do exactly what was asked of it. It was a solid foundation for an airframe designed to fight on the deck. At sea level, the atmosphere is dense and heavy, providing an abundant supply of oxygen to feed a piston engine. As an aircraft climbs, however, the weight of the air decreases, and the atmosphere grows progressively thinner. To maintain performance in this environment, an aircraft engine requires a supercharger. This mechanical compressor, driven directly by the engine crankshaft, uses a rapidly spinning impeller to force thin air into the intake manifold, artificially recreating the pressure conditions of lower altitudes. The supercharger in the Allison 5-1710 is a single-stage, single-speed unit. It features one impeller that spins at a fixed gear ratio. At lower altitudes, this system is highly effective, maintaining the exact manifold pressure needed for the engine to run at peak output. But as the Mustang climbs, the physical limitations of this single-stage design become absolute. The single impeller can only compress the air by a set ratio. Once the surrounding air becomes too thin, the supercharger can no longer pack enough oxygen into the cylinders. As the surrounding air pressure drops, the single impeller cannot compress the thinning air enough to maintain the required pressure inside the engine. The manifold pressure begins a steady, irreversible decline. This is not a sudden mechanical breakdown, but a physical limit of the supercharger's capacity. The Allison continues to run with its characteristic smoothness and reliability, but it is slowly starving for oxygen. Above 15,000 feet, this drop in intake pressure reduces the engine's output to roughly 800 horsepower. This limit acts as a hard physical ceiling for the early Mustang. The sleek, low-drag airframe can still fly, but it lacks the excess power needed to climb quickly or maneuver aggressively. It is a gradual loss of muscle as the aircraft climbs higher into the atmosphere. This high-altitude deficit clashed directly with the operational realities of the air war over Germany. To escape the worst of the deadly ground-based anti-aircraft fire, USAAF combat formations of B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators had to fly in the high-altitude regime, cruising between 20,000 and 25,000 feet. In this thin, freezing air, German interceptors like the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and Focke-Wulf 190 operated with power plants designed specifically for high-altitude combat, using advanced supercharging systems to maintain their performance. An escort fighter limited to 800 horsepower could not survive in this environment, let alone protect hundreds of vulnerable bombers. While the early Mustang had the structural strength and the fuel capacity to fly deep into Europe, the physical limits of its single-stage supercharger left it unable to fight in the skies, where the bomber crews faced their greatest threat. The solution to this high-altitude starvation lay across the Atlantic, inside the engineering offices of Rolls-Royce in Derby. British designers had faced their own desperate crisis with the Spitfire, which was struggling to match the high-altitude speed and climb of the German Focke-Wulf 190. Their response was the Merlin 61. This engine represented a massive leap in forced induction design, overcoming the limitations of single-stage compression by introducing a two-stage, two-speed supercharger. Instead of relying on a single impeller to compress the incoming air, the Merlin 61 employed two separate impellers mounted in series on a single shaft. The air was drawn in and compressed by the first stage impeller, then immediately fed into the second stage impeller, which compressed it even further before it reached the engine cylinders. This dual-stage compression allowed the engine to multiply the intake pressure far above what any single-stage system could achieve, preserving the air density necessary for combustion as the aircraft climbed into the thin upper atmosphere. If you value this kind of focused history of the machines and people behind the air war, subscribe for the next investigation. Compressing air to such high pressures introduced a severe thermodynamic problem that threatened to destroy the engine from within. Under intense compression, air temperature rises dramatically, often reaching hundreds of degrees. If this superheated pressurized air was fed directly into the engine cylinders, it would cause premature fuel ignition, leading to violent engine knocking and immediate mechanical failure. To prevent this, Rolls-Royce engineers added an aftercooler, a liquid-to-air heat exchanger positioned between the second-stage supercharger and the engine's induction manifold. A separate closed-loop cooling system pumped a mixture of water and glycol through this radiator-like unit, absorbing the heat from the compressed air charge before it entered the cylinders. This precise control of charge mixture temperature ensured stable combustion and permitted the engine to operate safely at high boost levels without risk of engine knock. By mid-1942, this advanced power plant was already in active service, proving its worth under actual combat conditions. Fitted to the new Spitfire Mark 9, the Merlin 61 had successfully re-established British parity in the high-altitude fighter sweeps over occupied Europe. For engineers observing this development, the technical implications were clear. The Spitfire Mark 9 proved that a liquid-cooled V-12 with a dual-stage supercharger could operate reliably in the stratosphere, because the Mustang airframe was already designed to accommodate a liquid-cooled V-12 engine of similar physical dimensions. The prospect of mating the clean, laminar-flow American fighter with the high-altitude British power plant transitioned from a theoretical concept to a highly plausible engineering solution. On April 30th, 1942, Ronald Ronnie Harker arrived at RAF Duxford. As a working test pilot and liaison engineer for Rolls-Royce, he was attached to the RAF's Air Fighting Development Unit. His daily work was to evaluate aircraft performance, identify mechanical issues, and act as a practical bridge between frontline pilots and the factory at Derby. On that spring morning, the unit gave him access to an Allison-powered Mustang Mark I. Harker buckled into the cockpit and took the fighter up for a 30-minute evaluation flight. As he put the aircraft through its paces, he experienced an exceptionally capable machine. The laminar flow wing and clean low-drag aerodynamics gave the fighter a level of handling and high-speed maneuverability that matched the frontline Spitfires of the day. It was incredibly stable, responsive to control inputs, and possessed an internal fuel capacity nearly 3 times greater than that of contemporary British interceptors. Harker recognized that the airframe itself was an aerodynamic masterpiece, but as he climbed higher, the physical limits of the power plant became clear. Above 15,000 feet, the single-stage supercharger on the Allison could not sustain the pressure. The Mustang became sluggish, its climb rate decayed, and the engine temperatures rose rapidly. The brilliant airframe was simply held back by its lack of high-altitude power. Returning to the ground, Harker relied on objective engineering data to make his case. On May 1, 1942, he drafted a formal written recommendation to the Air Ministry. In his report, Harker argued that this highly advanced airframe deserved a power plant capable of matching its aerodynamic gifts at high altitude. He calculated that fitting the Mustang with the new 2-stage Rolls-Royce Merlin 61 would solve its altitude deficiency and make the fighter significantly faster than a Spitfire at 30,000 feet. His assessment was simple, practical, and grounded in raw physics. Harker's memorandum did not trigger an immediate wave of enthusiasm. In the spring of 1942, the British Air Ministry faced severe industrial pressures. Every available Merlin engine was earmarked for frontline Spitfires defending the home skies, or for the heavy Lancaster bombers striking back at German industry. To the ministry's technical staff, diverting even a handful of these power plants to an unproven foreign airframe seemed highly risky. Engineering specialists raised immediate objections. The Merlin 61, with its heavy 2-stage supercharger, intercooler, and plumbing, weighed significantly more than the Allison Vyse 1710. This extra weight, concentrated far forward in the nose, threatened to shift the aircraft's center of gravity, the physical balance point around which all flight forces pivot. A forward shift in this balance point could destabilize the fighter during tight turns, or overstress the front landing gear during landings. Analysts also worried about structural limits, questioning whether the Mustang's wing spars and engine mounts could withstand the increased torque and weight of the powerful British engine. Across the Atlantic, the reaction from American planners was equally cautious. The United States Army Air Forces operated under its own strategic priorities and production schedules. Incorporating a foreign hand-fitted engine into a mass-produced American fighter program introduced immense supply chain headaches. Senior officers hesitated over licensing rights, transport vulnerabilities across U-boat-infested waters, and the complex task of adapting British engineering standards to American machine shops. To many in Washington, the Allison was a reliable domestic power plant that was already meeting the Army's immediate tactical requirements, making a major re-engineering program appear both disruptive and unnecessary. Harker understood that a policy battle could not be won through theory alone. He adjusted his approach, moving away from sweeping arguments about strategic adoption and focusing instead on a simple, low-risk request. He petitioned the authorities not for a massive production shift, but merely for permission to run a physical experiment. He wanted to modify a few existing airframes to gather concrete flight test data. This persistent, reasoned advocacy gradually eroded the bureaucratic inertia. By early summer, his quiet campaign gained the backing of influential observers who recognized the immense potential of the combination. The Air Ministry finally relented, authorizing a limited, temporary program to convert 5 existing Mustangs for experimental trials. It was a hard-won compromise, earned not by institutional authority, but by the steady accumulation of engineering logic. The 5 airframes designated for the trial, recorded in official Air Ministry files as AM-121, AM-208, AL-975, AM-203, and AL-963 arrived at Hucknall to undergo physical modifications. This was not a search for an overnight cure, but a highly disciplined exercise in evidence gathering. To accommodate the heavier, longer Merlin 61 and its complex 2-stage supercharger, Rolls-Royce engineers had to design entirely new steel tube engine mounts that projected further forward, redistributing the structural loads without fatally altering the aircraft's center of gravity. They also revised the carburetor intake arrangements, routing the airflow through a deeper scoop beneath the nose, and swapped the standard 3-bladed propeller for a massive 4-bladed rotor unit designed to absorb the immense torque of the new power plant. By October, The first conversion was complete. On October 13, 1942, Rolls-Royce chief test pilot Ronald Shepard walked out to the modified airframe AL-975, which historical records associate with this maiden flight. The mechanics finished their final checks. Shepard climbed into the cockpit, started the engine, and taxied toward the runway. This was no longer a theoretical exercise on a drawing board. It was a physical machine about to face the sky. Shepard opened the throttle. The Merlin roared, pulling the Mustang down the runway with an unfamiliar surge of acceleration. He lifted off and held the nose in a steep, aggressive climb. At low altitude, the plane felt heavy but stable. Then, he kept climbing, past 10,000 feet, past 15,000 feet. In the old Allison-powered fighter, this was where the power would begin to fade, the controls growing heavy as the engine choked for oxygen. But Shepard felt the automatic barometric switch engage the second-stage supercharger. The engine surged. It did not starve. It kept pulling. The flight test instruments recorded numbers that silenced the remaining skeptics at the Air Ministry. At 25,000 feet, where the Allison struggled to produce 800 horsepower, the Merlin 61 delivered an output past 1,600 horsepower. This was a near doubling of the Mustang's previous high-altitude performance. The rate of climb, which once hovered around 2,200 feet per minute, shot past 3,500 feet per minute, allowing the fighter to reach 20,000 feet in just under 10 minutes. Top speed jumped by 50 miles per hour, peaking at over 430 miles per hour in the thin air where German interceptors operated. The remaining 4 converted airframes completed their modifications over the following weeks, validating Shepard's initial flight with hours of rigorous engineering data. The test pilots pushed the Mustangs through high-G maneuvers and sustained high-speed dives, confirming that the clean laminar flow airframe could easily tolerate the torque and physical weight of the British Phi-12. The experimental conversion was not a partial or incremental improvement. It was a complete overhaul of the aircraft's performance envelope. The question was no longer whether the Merlin could save the Mustang. The question was how an empire stretched to its industrial limits could ever produce enough of them. In June 1942, the diplomatic and military negotiations between London and Washington culminated in a formal licensing agreement. The contract authorized the Packard Motor Car Company of Detroit to mass produce the Rolls-Royce Merlin on American soil. Under this arrangement, the imported British design received the United States military designation of the VI 1650. This agreement represented an essential structural bridge across the Atlantic. The partnership served as a deliberate convergence of complementary strengths, bypassing any sense of competition between rival industrial systems. Great Britain possessed invaluable combat-tested design experience, refined through the desperate air battles over Europe, while its factories remained stretched to their absolute physical limits. The United States offered unmatched large-scale industrial capacity, backed by modern machine tools and standardized production methods. To turn the contract into reality, Rolls-Royce dispatched a specialized technology transfer team to Michigan, led by chief designer Sir Stanley Hooker and engine test manager Dr. Frederick Sutton. They brought complete sets of engineering drawings, master engine samples, and years of hard-won metallurgical data. This partnership required a massive sharing of intellectual property. Packard engineers received thousands of individual blueprints drawn using British third-angle projection. Before a single machine could be turned on, American draftsmen had to carefully redraw every sheet to meet standardized manufacturing practices in Detroit. This painstaking translation focused entirely on ensuring that an engine designed in Derby could be built by the thousands in Michigan, bridging British aeronautical genius with American industrial muscle. Packard's Plant 2 on East Grand River Avenue in Detroit was originally designed to stamp out steel body panels and assemble rugged automobile engines. Facilities where clearances of a few thousandths of an inch were perfectly acceptable for the domestic car market. Converting this massive automotive infrastructure to manufacture the highly complex V1650 required an immediate and drastic shift in industrial standards, materials control, and factory floor discipline. The two-stage supercharger on the Merlin ran at rotational speeds that would quickly destroy standard automotive bearings, demanding a level of precision that Detroit had never attempted at this scale. To handle these extreme physical forces, Packard installed hundreds of specialized precision machining centers and advanced heat treatment furnaces capable of hardening steel alloys to exact, unyielding metallurgical specifications. Each batch of high nickel steel arriving at the plant had to undergo rigorous chemical analysis to ensure the alloy met the exact tensile strength needed to survive high-altitude temperatures, while every crankshaft underwent magnetic particle testing to detect internal flaws. The most intense manufacturing challenges were concentrated in the supercharger assembly, which required perfect alignment of the dual impellers on a single shaft, spinning at over 20,000 revolutions per minute. The high-ratio gear train driving these impellers could not tolerate even a microscopic surface defect without risking catastrophic failure, and the double seal system, which kept engine oil from contaminating the pressurized fuel-air mixture, required hand lapping with microscopic abrasives to ensure a perfect gas-tight fit. This transition was not merely a matter of installing advanced machine tools, it was a massive human training effort. Packard initiated a rigorous instructional program that taught 200 women machinists and 150 veteran auto workers how to operate precision micrometers, optical comparators, and thread grinders. These workers, accustomed to the more forgiving margins of peacetime manufacturing, learned to measure and fit complex components to within 10 millionths of an inch. Every stage of the assembly, from checking the runout on the propeller shaft to the final torque settings on the cylinder head studs, was subjected to an absolute inspection regime. By December 1943, the Detroit plant was delivering approximately 1,500 V1650 engines every month, successfully matching the output of the main British Merlin facility at Crewe. These mass-produced American engines did not simply replicate the hand-fitted standards established by Rolls-Royce. They often exceeded them, passing 99.4% of their 30-minute high-altitude test runs. The automotive workforce of Detroit had successfully mastered the highest levels of aviation precision, turning a complex British design into a highly reliable, mass-produced power plant for the skies over Europe. The blueprint translation was only the first step. The true test of this transition occurred on the factory floor, where thousands of American machinists, assembly workers, and supervisors had to master an unfamiliar and demanding foreign machine. In Great Britain, Rolls-Royce relied on a long-standing tradition of hand-fitting, where skilled craftsmen individually scraped, filed, and matched components to achieve a perfect fit. Detroit, however, operated on the principle of absolute interchangeability. Packard engineers had to redesign the manufacturing processes so that any single piston, valve, or supercharger gear could be pulled from a bin and installed in any engine without modification. This approach required a level of machining precision and repeatability that had never been attempted on such a massive scale. If a single part varied by even a fraction of a millimeter, the high-altitude performance of the two-stage supercharger would fail. Under intense wartime pressure, the Packard workforce adapted to these unforgiving standards. They learned to operate new precision grinders and optical comparators, transforming the way they worked to produce a highly delicate aviation power plant with the speed of an automotive assembly line. This industrial achievement turned a specialized, low-volume British engine into a highly dependable, mass-produced asset, providing a steady supply of power plants at a scale no single British factory could match. Only now can the larger consequence be seen. An engine initially treated by both air forces as an unnecessary risk had become the change that determined whether American bombers survived missions over Germany. But high-altitude power alone was not enough to solve the escort crisis. To protect the bombers all the way to their targets and back, the newly re-engined fighters had to carry enough gasoline for hours of sustained flight. This meant that the engineering triumph in Detroit had to be paired with a radical rethink of the Mustang's internal fuel capacity and aerodynamic range. Solving the high-altitude power deficit only solved half of the escort equation. The heavy bombers of the 8th Air Force needed protection for hours, across thousands of miles of hostile airspace, which made fuel capacity a distinct and urgent engineering challenge. To achieve this, engineers modified the internal structure of the P-51, inserting a self-sealing fuel tank directly behind the pilot's seat. This modification raised the Mustang's internal fuel capacity from the original 184 gallons to 269 gallons, though the extra weight far behind the center of gravity made the aircraft highly unstable until the fuselage tank was nearly empty. To extend this reach even further, technicians fitted plumbing under the wings for paper mache or metal external drop tanks. These disposable tanks allowed the Mustang to carry enough fuel to extend its total range beyond 1,600 miles. According to supplied comparisons, this configuration gave the Mustang more than twice the unescorted combat radius of the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt at that stage of the war, using a standardized combat radius definition of 350 miles for the P-47 compared to over 800 miles for the long-range Mustang. This massive range meant that the vision of a continuous escort was at last a physical reality. It was a triumph made possible by the persistence of Rolls-Royce test pilot Ronnie Harker, the brilliant design adjustments of engineers like Stanley Hooker and the Packard drafting teams, and the dedication of the Detroit machinists. Ultimately, it was validated in the freezing skies by the pilots of the 352nd Fighter Group. If you have a family member who served as a bomber crewman, fighter pilot, or ground crew member during the daylight bombing campaign over Germany, or who worked in wartime aircraft engine production, please share their story in the comments below. Subscribe to the channel for more focused investigations into aviation history. The morning of February 13th, 1944, begins in bitter cold at RAF Bodney. Pilots of the 352nd Fighter Group climb into the cockpits of their Mustangs, the Packard-built engines turning over in the damp English mist. Ground crews pull away the chocks, and the fighters rise into the gray overcast, heading east toward Germany. This mission represents a radical departure from the defensive struggles of the previous years, pushing the boundaries of what a single-engine fighter can achieve. While later records focus on the massed flights of March, this early long-range mission stands as a severe test of endurance, designed to prove that American fighters can provide continuous escort all the way to Berlin and back. In the earlier phases of the air war, escorting fighters operated on a strict, fragmented relay system. Thunderbolts or Lightnings would accompany the heavy B-17 and B-24 bomber formations as far as their fuel allowed, before turning back and leaving the bombers vulnerable to German interceptors over the heart of the Reich. A continuous escort means rewriting the tactical rules of the strategic bombing campaign. It defines a commitment where the same fighter group stays with the bomber stream through the most vulnerable interior portion of the flight, guarding the formations through the target run and bringing the crews safely home. To achieve this level of sustained escort, multiple engineering and human elements must work in perfect synchronization. The Mustang requires its full internal fuel capacity, external drop tanks, and the absolute mechanical reliability of its liquid-cooled V-12. It also demands high-altitude performance to match the Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts at 25,000 feet, paired with disciplined, aggressive pilot tactics. As the pilots climb into the thin, freezing air of the upper atmosphere, the Packard-built superchargers automatically shift into high gear. The engines do not choke or lose power. The pilots maintain their positions alongside the heavy bombers, eyes scanning the horizon for enemy interceptors, ready to fight in the stratosphere. If a relative served as a bomber crewman, fighter pilot, or ground crewman during the daylight bombing campaign over Germany, or worked in aircraft engine production during the war, share that story in the comments. The strategic results of this engineering change are immediate and measurable. Prior to the widespread deployment of the Merlin-powered Mustang, daylight raids without sustained protection suffered heavy losses. Missions like the August 1943 raid on Schweinfurt and Regensburg saw loss rates climb past 20%, forcing Allied planners to suspend unescorted operations. With continuous fighter escort, those loss rates dropped dramatically, stabilizing at a fraction of their previous highs and allowing the heavy bombers to strike far into the German heartland with increased security. This historic shift in the air war was not the result of a single sudden breakthrough, but the product of persistent human effort. It began with the quiet advocacy of Rolls-Royce test pilot Ronnie Harker, who first recognized the untapped potential of the American airframe. It was carried forward by Rolls-Royce engineers like Stanley Hooker and the design teams at Packard, who translated complex blueprints to meet the scale of American manufacturing. It was built by the thousands of Detroit machinists who mastered the tight tolerances of aviation production under intense wartime pressure. Ultimately, it was validated in the freezing skies over Germany by the pilots of the 352nd Fighter Group, who trusted their lives to the Merlin engine and changed the course of the air war. Subscribe to follow our next historical investigation. The tactical realities of the daylight bombing campaign shifted rapidly once long-range escort became standard. Before the arrival of reliable escort fighters, 8th Air Force missions into Germany suffered heavily, with bomber losses averaging approximately 7% per raid. Statistically, facing a 7% loss rate on every mission made finishing a standard 25-mission combat tour almost impossible. Period estimates suggested that only about 25% of bomber crews would survive to finish their tours. Once Merlin-powered Mustangs became consistently available, these mission losses fell to around 3%. While the Merlin engine was the enabling change, it did not act in isolation. The drop in aircraft losses was also shaped by evolving American fighter tactics, the steady attrition of experienced German pilots, tighter bomber formations, and the introduction of advanced fuel system modifications. Yet, the raw numbers at the end of the war tell a clear story. By May 1945, manufacturers had built more than 15,500 Mustangs of all variants. In the air, P-51 pilots were credited with destroying nearly 5,000 enemy aircraft, with another 4,300 destroyed on the ground during high-speed strafing runs. This massive operational sweep stands in sharp contrast to the early days of No. 26 Squadron at Saw-Bridgeworth. The pilots who once flew low-altitude sweeps under the gray clouds of occupied France, restricted to tactical work on the deck, now possessed a machine that could climb straight into the stratosphere. They could fly alongside the heavy bomber formations, stay with them all the way into Germany, engage Luftwaffe interceptors at altitude, and return home with range and altitude performance the earlier installation could not provide. This expansion of Allied air power was not the work of abstract forces, but of specific individuals. It was driven by the persistent advocacy of Rolls-Royce test pilot Ronnie Harker, who first envisioned the engine change, and the work of British design engineers who drew the initial modifications. It was made real by the Packard engineers and the thousands of Detroit factory workers who mastered the tight tolerances of an unfamiliar, highly complex engine under intense wartime pressure, and by the pilots of the 352nd Fighter Group who took those machines into combat. If you have a family member who served as a bomber crewman, fighter pilot, or ground crew member during the daylight bombing campaign over Germany, or who worked in wartime engine production, please share their story in the comments. Subscribe for more deeply researched stories of the machines and people of the air war. Today, the Merlin's roar still echoes at air shows, yet its true legacy belongs to the families of those who survived. Ronnie Harker's vision and the precision of Rolls-Royce and Packard engineers made the impossible real. The pilots of the 352nd Fighter Group proved it in the skies. Their shared triumph reminds us that when technical audacity meets industrial scale, the course of history changes forever.